Glass first, then silence, then the slow, awful creak of understanding that someone had just thrown a brick through my window, and I was alone, and I was breathing too fast to scream. I stood in my kitchen for what felt like years, hands braced against the counter, staring at the jagged constellations scattered across my living room floor. The note was tied to it with twine. Old-fashioned, almost polite, like whoever sent it had manners they wanted you to notice. Stop asking questions, or we stop warning you. My father had been dead for 4 months. The police called it an accident, a wet road, a guardrail that gave too easily, a man who should have known better than to drive in the rain. They closed the file before I could finish grieving. I'd been a journalist long enough to know a closed file isn't the same as an empty one. Now someone knew I was looking. Marcus, my editor, didn't yell. He was worse than that. He went very quiet on the phone. The kind of quiet that meant he was already making decisions without me. By morning, he had a name. By noon, that name was standing in my doorway. Joon Park. 6 feet of absolute stillness. Dark jacket, dark eyes, jaw like something carved out of patience. He didn't fill the room so much as organize it, everything rearranging itself around the fact of him. He held out his hand. Miss Nwosu. I shook it. His grip was calm. Of course it was. You didn't have to come tonight, I said, because I needed to say something that wasn't, you looked like trouble with excellent posture. Your editor said tonight. A pause. So, tonight. He swept my apartment in under 4 minutes. Checked windows I didn't know could open. Tested a lock I'd assumed was fine. Stood in my hallway and looked at the broken glass with an expression I couldn't read. Not horror, not indifference. Something clinical and precise, like a doctor assessing a wound. Has this happened before? He asked. The brick? No. The threats. I hesitated. The email started 3 weeks ago. I didn't think. You didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it like one. I'm a journalist. Anonymous sources. Hostile readers. It's not part of anything anymore. He turned and looked at me directly, the first time since he'd arrived. Something shifted in that gaze. Not warmth, exactly. More like attention. Complete, unblinking, irreversible attention. Someone escalated, which means they're scared of what you know, which means you were right to keep digging. Another pause. And you need to stop being alone. I almost laughed. You don't even know what I'm investigating. No, he said simply. I don't need to. I just need to know where you are. What you're investigating isn't the question, he said, voice even. It's how close you are to the part that gets people killed. Moving you tonight would make you a hostage to my solutions, he said, like it was a rule. For now, you stay in your own space, and I bring safety to you. He slept on my couch that night, or didn't sleep, I couldn't tell. I lay in the dark and listened to the specific silence of someone keeping watch, a sound I hadn't realized had its own texture until now. I'd spent 4 months being afraid in an empty apartment, carrying my father's secrets like stones in both pockets, trusting no one because no one had asked to be trusted. And lying there, listening to a stranger breathe in the next room, I felt for the first time since the guardrail gave safe. That terrified me more than the brick. He guarded my body. He started guarding my heart without asking. By the 3rd morning, I knew how he took his coffee. Black, no sugar. 2 minutes steep if it was pour over, swallowed fast if it wasn't. He drank it standing at the window, always angled so he could see both the street and the room, a habit so ingrained it looked like posture. It looked like personality. Maybe it was. Joon Park didn't integrate into my life so much as restructure it. He changed my morning route after day 1. Different street, different timing, unpredictable intervals. He rotated on a schedule he never shared. He checked beneath my car every morning without announcing it, crouching down with the quiet focus of a man who'd done it 1,000 times and found something real at least once. He studied crowds the way I read headlines, fast, analytical, looking for the anomaly. At the coffee shop we stopped at each morning, his eyes moved before his body did, cataloging exits, registering faces. He never sat with his back to the door. Neither did I anymore. "You're doing it again," he said one evening, not looking up from the documents I'd spread across the dining table. "Doing what?" "Watching me work." I looked back at my laptop. I was thinking, you were watching me. He wasn't wrong. I hated that. The late nights were the worst, or the best, depending on which part of me was keeping score. We'd sit across from each other, hours dissolving, my investigation bleeding into his quiet commentary. He never offered opinions. He asked questions. Sharp ones, the kind that cut to the bone of a problem and left you wondering how you'd missed it yourself. Once, near midnight, he laughed, barely a short exhale through the nose, a fractional softening around his mouth. I'd made a joke about a particularly absurd corporate shell company name, and he'd laughed, and I felt it like a key turning in a lock I didn't know was closed. I told myself it was proximity. Adrenaline. The psychology of crisis bonding. I had read about crisis bonding. I was aware of crisis bonding. I was also aware of the way his hands moved, deliberate, economic, never wasted motion. The kind of hands that had been trained to do specific things and had made peace with that. "Stop. Someone is watching you," he said. It was Thursday. I'd been reaching for my phone. "You mean the threats?" "I mean physically." His voice hadn't changed registers. That was the thing about Joon. He delivered earthquakes in the same tone other people use to discuss weather. "Blue sedan. Rotates with a gray Civic. They've been on your pattern for 6 days." 6 days. He'd known for 6 days and watched them back, silent, measuring. "Why didn't you?" "Because I needed to know how many." A pause, the weight of it settling. "Now I do." He looked at me then. Not the crowd-scanning look, not the tactical assessment look. Something that lasted a half-second longer than it should have. Something with a question buried inside it that neither of us was ready to answer. "How many?" I asked. "Enough," he said, "that you shouldn't be afraid." He meant it as reassurance, but the way my heart moved when he said it had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the fact that I was already in trouble of a different kind entirely. The parking garage smelled like concrete and old oil, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I'd always hated this particular building. 4 levels of flickering fluorescence and too many blind corners. I'd parked on level 2. Habit. Joon had wanted level 1. I hadn't listened. 3 men came from behind a support column, fast, coordinated, no wasted movement. 1 toward me, 2 toward Joon. They'd done this before. You could tell by the way they moved without speaking, reading each other through peripheral vision the way predators do. What happened next took 11 seconds. I counted later, replaying it in the fixed, compulsive way your mind returns to violence, trying to make it make sense. Joon moved before they closed the distance. That was the first thing that didn't fit. Not reaction, anticipation. He stepped inside the arc of the first swing with a calm that bordered on boredom, redirected the arm, used the man's own momentum to fold him against the concrete pillar with a sound I won't describe. The second came with a knife. Joon disarmed him in 2 movements, precise, sequential. The knife skittered across the floor, and Joon was already turning, left elbow catching the third man across the jaw with the efficiency of someone closing a cabinet. Clean, conclusive. 11 seconds. All 3 men on the ground. Joon turned to me, breathing normally, jacket still straight. He looked at my face, and whatever he saw there made something flicker behind his eyes. "Are you hurt?" "No." My voice was hollow. "Who trained you like that?" He didn't answer immediately. He crouched, checked the pockets of the unconscious man closest to us, found a phone and a folded paper he studied for 2 seconds before pocketing it himself, quick and practiced. "Not private security curriculum," I said. "No." He stood. "Joon, they'll send more." He was already steering me toward the stairwell, one hand at my back, warm and immovable. "We need to move. Answer me." He stopped walking. We were in the stairwell now, a single bulb overhead, and in that brutal yellow light, I could see something he usually kept behind glass, something older than his composure and harder than his silence. "I learned from men who couldn't afford to lose," he said. "Hesitation gets people buried, Amara. I learned that early." The way he said it wasn't cruel, that was somehow worse. It was simply true, in the way that only lived experience can be true, stripped of drama, of apology, of anything that might make it easier to hear. I looked at the man in front of me, same face, same dark eyes, same hands that had made 3 armed men disappear in 11 seconds. I had been leaning toward him for days, drawn by something I'd rationalized as dependence, proximity, stress. Standing in that stairwell, my heart beat loud in my ears. I felt the lean hard, and this time it terrified me for reasons that had nothing to do with bricks through windows. I was afraid of him. I was afraid of how little that changed anything. 3:04 a.m. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in the apartment. I'd told him I was sleeping. I'd waited until his breathing on the other side of the wall settled into something slow and even. Then I searched. Joon Park, security contractor. Licensed, bonded, 3 years of client testimonials, and one nondescript corporate website that loaded just a half-second too slowly. Like something assembled in a hurry by someone who knew what a real company's website looked like. I was a journalist. I knew what a trail looked like. I also knew what the deliberate absence of one looked like. The licensing board had no record of him. The business address was a mail forwarding service. His educational credentials traced back to a university in Seoul that, when I cross-referenced its alumni database through a contact at an international press bureau, had no record of his enrollment. Every door I opened led to a wall. He was constructed, assembled, a fiction, wearing a person's face. I didn't sleep. At 3:40, I stood in the doorway of the living room. He was already awake, sitting upright in the dark, still dressed, watching me the way he watched everything completely. "How long have you known I'd find it?" I asked. A long silence. He didn't insult me by pretending not to understand. "I hoped you wouldn't." His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I told myself, if you were busy enough with the case, who are you?" He stood slowly, moved to the window. The city glittered behind him, indifferent and enormous. "My real name is Joon Sok-won. Park was a borrowed name, clean on paper, dead in reality, the kind of identity you can wear until someone decides to peel it off. I worked for an organization connected to the network your father exposed, Beck's network." He paused. "I knew your father, Amara. Not well, but I knew what he'd found, and I knew what they did to him for it." The room tilted slightly. "You were there, not when it happened, but I knew it wasn't an accident." He turned. "I left after that. I built the cover. I came to you because I owed him that much, and because they will not stop, not until you stop breathing or stop digging." "You lied to me." "Yes. Every day since the emails began 3 weeks. Yes." He didn't flinch, didn't decorate it. Just held the word between us like a stone. "I needed you to trust me long enough to keep you alive. I knew, if you knew the truth, you'd—" "Run," I said. "I'd run." Something passed across his face. Not relief that I understood. Something that looked closer to grief. "If you knew who I was," he said quietly, "you'd run." I stood in the dark apartment, 4 months of grief and weeks of fear and 11 seconds in a parking garage, all converging into a single unbearable point, and I looked at the man with the fabricated name and the real sorrow in his eyes. I didn't run. I didn't know yet if that made me brave or broken. He told me everything. It took 3 hours and 2 pots of coffee and a particular kind of silence between sentences that felt like standing at the edge of something enormous. He'd been 23 when Beck's organization recruited him. Not with threat, with opportunity, which is how those networks always begin. A young man with tactical training, financial desperation, and the particular misfortune of being exceptional at things criminal enterprises value. He'd climbed because he was smart and controlled and never took more than he was given. He ran security operations. He knew where the money moved and what it purchased, and which officials in which offices accepted envelopes that arrived without return addresses. My father had been one of the journalists who got close, genuinely close to exposing the financial architecture underneath Beck's construction empire. Not the violence, the money, the municipal contracts, the city council members, and the federal infrastructure funds that disappeared into subsidiaries with reassuring names. He was careful, Joon said. Methodical. He reminded me of you. I looked at my hands. They decided he was too close. Beck gave the order. 2 men handled it. They made it look like the road. You didn't stop it. I didn't know until after. His jaw tightened. That was the line I hadn't crossed yet. When I understood what they'd done, a pause. I became difficult. And then I became absent. Now Beck knew Amara Nwosu had her father's files, her father's sources, and apparently her father's stubbornness. The surveillance wasn't amateur. The ambush in the garage was a message, not an attempt. If they'd wanted me dead, I'd be dead. They wanted me scared. They wanted the story buried in the particular way fear buries things, quietly, and by the person who carries it. We began building the case together. His knowledge filled the gaps my father's documents had, left names, account numbers, the specific language of financial transactions designed to evade detection. I verified, sourced, cross-referenced. He translated the criminal architecture into something a federal prosecutor could read. The surveillance escalated. My email was hacked. A source went silent overnight and wouldn't say why. Someone sent flowers to my office with no card, and Joon's expression when he saw them told me that was a threat with a specific meaning. I was better off not knowing. One night, very late, he sat across from me and watched me work with an expression that had stopped being tactical sometime in the last week and started being something else entirely, something without a professional name. You should be afraid, he said. I am. Good fear keeps you sharp. The other kind. He stopped. What other kind? He looked at me for a long moment. The city hummed outside. The files between us contained enough to end careers, end freedom, potentially end lives. The kind that makes you do things anyway, he said finally. That kind will get you killed, or it'll save everything. His voice dropped. I don't know which one you are yet. He was lying. We both knew it. He knew exactly which one I was. He stood, and just before he moved toward the window, he said it quietly, almost to himself, in a voice stripped of everything protective and professional. I'll burn this city before I let them touch you. I believed him. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. Not the declaration, the fact that I believed it absolutely and wanted it. They came on a Tuesday, 4 vehicles, 8 men. A level of coordination that said this was no longer a message. Joon got the alert at 11 p.m., a contact inside Beck's network, one of 3 he'd cultivated during his extraction, a man who sent single-word texts that required no explanation. That night's word was, tonight. We were in a safe house by 11:20, a 3rd-floor apartment in a building whose entrance I hadn't known existed until Joon opened a door in a parking structure that looked like concrete and wasn't. He moved with quiet authority through the space, and I understood suddenly that this was not a rented room. It was his, part of an infrastructure that predated his cover identity by years. Then the men arrived at my apartment building, and Joon's phone lit up twice, and people I had never seen before materialized. That was when I understood the scale of what I'd been standing beside. 3 cars arrived, within 7 minutes, men and 1 woman, all coordinated, all armed, none of them speaking to Joon with the deference of employees. They spoke to him with something older than hierarchy recognition, the specific respect of people who have trusted each other in situations where trust was the only thing between them and catastrophe. His network, I said, not to anyone. Remaining network, Joon said, from directly behind me. The parts that stayed when I left. They held the building. There was a confrontation I only heard 2 floors below, muffled and brutal and brief. Joon stood at the window beside me, watching exit routes, his hand close enough to mine on the sill that I felt the warmth of it. When it was over, he turned to me with the report delivered in under 30 seconds. Beck's men had retreated. 2, detained, handed to a federal contact who didn't ask provenance questions. The message Beck would receive in the morning would be unambiguous. "This is your life," I said. "This is still your life." "Yes, and you pulled me into it." He was quiet for a moment. Around us, his people moved with professional efficiency, and the apartment hummed with the particular energy of a war that had been paused rather than ended. "I pulled you through it," he said. "There's a difference." I thought about my father's files, the months of silence and grief, and a closed case that was never closed. I thought about brick and twine, and a note left by someone who believed journalists could be frightened into silence. I thought about every morning route Joon had changed, every crowd he'd read, every moment of stillness that had stood between me and harm I couldn't see coming. I could leave. The federal case was built. I had a contact at the prosecutor's office. The story would run with or without me in this apartment. I could disappear into normalcy and let someone else finish it. "Tell me the honest risk," I said. He told me. Numbers, names, timelines. No softening, no omission. The kind of honesty that respects someone enough to let them be afraid. When he finished, I nodded. "Then we finish it." Something moved in his face, something raw and unguarded, that he closed off quickly, but I caught it. I'd become fluent in the small vocabulary of his expressions. He looked at me like I was something he hadn't prepared himself to find. "Okay," he said quietly, "we finish it." The courtroom smelled like recirculated air and paper, and the particular anxiety of people whose fates were being decided by language. I had testified before. Smaller things, local corruption, a city council story that went sideways, nothing like this. Nothing where the defense attorney looked at me across a federal courtroom with the specific smile of someone who has been paid enough to dismantle a person. They came from my credibility methodically. They introduced Joon his real name, his real history, the years inside Beck's organization as evidence not of Beck's network, but of my contamination. They argued I was a journalist who had become romantically entangled, or at least appeared to be, with a career criminal, fed false information by a man with personal grievances and a fabricated identity, too compromised by emotion to distinguish evidence from manipulation. It was sophisticated. I had to admit that. If I'd been in the jury box, the argument would have given me pause. But they had a problem. The documents existed independently of Joon. My father had gathered evidence across 4 years, sourced and verified, stored in a system Joon had never accessed. The financial records, the shell company filings, the municipal contract irregularities, none of it required Joon's testimony to stand. It stood on its own, cross-referenced against public records and confirmed by 2 additional sources who testified behind screens. Joon had stayed away. His absence was a gift he'd given me without being asked, understanding before I did that his presence near the witness stand would be the one thing the defense could turn into a weapon. He was present in the evidence and absent from the room, which was the most useful thing he could be. The security footage was the turning point. 4 minutes of clear, time-stamped footage from a municipal building showing Beck in direct meeting with 2 officials who had, under oath, denied ever meeting him. The defense objected to its admission 5 times. The judge overruled them 5 times with diminishing patience. I watched the jury. In courtrooms, you learn to read 12 strangers the way Joon reads crowds, looking for the tell, the fractional shift that says something has landed. It landed. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Clear sky, mundane weather for a day that felt like it should have had weather. Guilty on 9 of 11 counts. Beck's face did not change when they read it. That was the thing about men who run empires. They practice stillness until it becomes indistinguishable from absence. Outside the courthouse, I stood in the sharp autumn air and called my editor. "It's done," I said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Your father would be—" "I know," I said. "I know." I didn't cry until I was in the car. Then I cried for a long time, grieving everything at once: my father, the months of fear, the version of my life that existed before a brick came through a window and a man with a fabricated name arrived to stand between me and the dark. My phone showed one unread message, sent at 2:47 p.m. during deliberations. It said only, "Whatever happens, you were right to look, no name." But I knew the cadence of it. I knew it the way I'd learned his coffee order and his laugh and the particular texture of his silences. I held the phone for a long time. My therapist had a plant on her windowsill that I watched instead of her face during the first 4 sessions. Broad leaves, very green, aggressively alive. It became a reference point, a way of marking weeks the way some people mark them by calendar. Beck's network dismantled across 6 weeks following the verdict. Assets seized, subsidiaries dissolved, the long institutional machinery of accountability grinding through what years of purchased silence had protected. 2 additional prosecutions were opened. A city council member resigned. The story ran in 3 national publications. My byline appeared above my father's preliminary research, which I had requested, specifically his name, on the work that had cost him everything. I moved into a new apartment in the 3rd month. 3rd floor, lots of light. I checked beneath my car for 2 weeks before I stopped, and the stopping felt like something significant, the body releasing what the mind had already been told was over. I started a new position at a publication that covered financial crime, methodical, documented, the kind of work that built slowly and mattered. I went to therapy on Tuesdays. Some sessions were productive. Some were me staring at the plant while my therapist waited with professional patience for me to find language for things that didn't want to be spoken. Joon had disappeared in the clean, considered way of someone who knows how to disappear. No abrupt ending, just a gradual de-escalation of presence. The last time I'd seen him in person was the day before the trial began. A brief, practical conversation about testimony and timing that we both dressed in logistics to avoid dressing in anything else. I told myself it was appropriate. He was organized crime. I was the journalist whose father had died, exposing organized crime. The symmetry of us had always been impossible. A beautiful, dangerous, temporary overlap of 2 lives that were never meant to run in the same direction. I told myself this on Tuesdays. On Thursdays, it was less convincing. My therapist asked once, carefully, about the people I'd become close to during the investigation. I talked around Joon for 20 minutes in detailed circles before she said gently, "You can just say his name." I said his name. It didn't help, but it was accurate. 6 months passed, the way recovery passes, not like healing, which implies a return to a previous state, more like reconstruction. New habits, new rhythms, new ways of moving through the world that were built on what had happened rather than despite it. I was different, not damaged different, harder in some ways, more permeable in others, capable of more fear than I'd known before, and also, somehow, more capable of choosing anyway. The article about my father ran on a Sunday. It was the best thing I'd ever written. He would have had notes. That evening, sitting in my new apartment with good light and a cup of coffee going cold on the table, I got a message from a number I'd never deleted. "The garage is still there. I'll be there Thursday at 8 if you want to talk. If you don't, I understand." I read it 6 times. Then I closed my phone and watched the last of the evening light dissolve against the wall and felt the thing in my chest that I had been carefully not calling by its name for 6 months. It had a name. I knew it did. Level 2. Same fluorescent flicker, same smell of concrete and cold oil. Some things don't change to accommodate what happened inside them. He was standing by the support column, not leaning against it, not performing ease, just standing, waiting, in the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with the possibility that the person they're waiting for might not come. I came. He saw me at the top of the ramp, and something moved across his face before he could architect it back into control, before he could make it disappear. I'd become fluent in that. I had 6 months and 11 seconds and 3 weeks of shared late nights to be fluent in that. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The garage hummed around us, a car on the level above, distant traffic, the specific urban sound that had become, in my memory, the backdrop of the worst and most important night of my life. "You came," he said. "I came." He nodded once, slowly. "How are you?" "Rebuilt," I said. "Different. Getting there." A pause. "Therapy helps." Apparently, I had a lot to process. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. The exhale laugh I'd heard once in my kitchen, weeks before the world had clarified itself into something impossible to ignore. "Joon." I stepped closer. "I need to say some things, and I need you to let me finish before you offer me an exit." His jaw tensed. He nodded. "I know what you are, what you were. I know your real name and your real history, and the specific way that history makes every rational argument against this very loud." I held his gaze. "I also know how you take your coffee. I know the sound of you keeping watch at 3 a.m. I know what your face did when I said I was staying, in the safe house, when I could have left." I stopped. "Let that breathe. I know that you have been constructing distance between us for 6 months because you decided, without asking me, that I deserved normalcy more than I deserved the thing I actually want." He was very still. The stillness, that meant he was listening with everything. "I spent months being angry at you," I said, "for the lie, for all of it. And I got to the other side of the anger and found out it was still there underneath. All of it. Inconveniently, stubbornly, completely. Amara, let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I'm not afraid of your past. I'm a journalist who spent a year inside it. I understand it better than most people ever will. I'm not looking for you to be something uncomplicated." I tried uncomplicated. It didn't feel like anything. I breathed. "I want the person who asked questions until midnight and changed my routes because he was paying attention and told me the truth about risk because he respected me enough to—" I paused. "I want you. Not the protection, not the cover, not the function. You." The fluorescent light flickered once overhead. Joon exhaled slow, deep, the particular exhale of someone releasing something they'd been holding for a very long time. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. The ordinary parts. This." His hands moved, briefly, gesturing at the space between us, a gesture more uncertain than anything I'd ever seen from him. "I know how to keep people alive. I know how to build covers and read crowds and plan for the worst. I don't know." "Neither do I," I said. "I'm a journalist who fell for a man who ran monsters and stayed anyway. I'm not exactly a template." Something broke open in his expression finally, fully, the thing behind the glass, not the controlled attention I'd catalogued across weeks of proximity. Something that had been waiting longer than I'd known him to be seen. He crossed the distance between us, slowly, deliberately, with all the intention he brought to everything. He raised one hand and touched my face careful, like something he'd decided was worth being careful with. "I'm done hiding," he said. "I know." I put my hand over his, held it there. "Me too." Hi. The garage held us in its industrial light. 2 people in the place where it had split open and shown us what we were made of. Not the beginning. We were past beginnings. This was something harder and more honest than a beginning. This was a choice. His forehead touched mine. I felt him breathe. Outside, the city kept its noise, indifferent and alive. Inside, in the flicker, and the concrete, and the smell of oil, I let go of every version of this I'd talked myself out of across 6 months of sensible Tuesday mornings. I chose the man, the whole of him. The dark and the stillness, and the laugh that happened only once, and the hands that had kept me alive, and the eyes that had never, not once, looked away. He held me like he knew how to be careful with the things that mattered. We stood there a long time. It was enough. It was, finally, entirely enough.